5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thunderbirds are go.
Hello and welcome back to another episode. Now that was one of the most iconic countdowns of all time in all of human history, possibly second only to the moon landings in Houston. Yes, today I'm going to be talking about the Thunderbirds and my love, my adoration for Gerry Anderson's amazing television invention. This series which gripped children around the world and has influenced millions of people's childhoods is rightly iconic. Now, the Thunderbirds first came around in 1965. On the 30th of September, that's when the first episode, I believe, was aired. And by August 1966, they made 32 episodes, which is a tremendous amount of work and effort in less than a year. And the Thunderbirds were immensely popular. And really, those 32 episodes have carried them through the last 50, 60 years to modern times. Now, I first was introduced to the Thunderbirds in the 1990s when they did their first big rerun, really, in Britain. That's when I got this lovely Thunderbirds annual from 1992, and also the majority of my Thunderbirds toys come from then, because that's when I really got into the Thunderbirds. Now, some people don't quite get the Thunderbirds. They think, well, the puppets, they look a bit naff, don't they? Or the models look a bit weird. But actually, that's part of the charm, the physicality of the Thunderbirds. They used something called super marionation. Now, a marionette is a puppet, and it's kind of like a play on things like Technicolor. It's this idea of, you know, filmed in Technicolor, filmed in super marionation. They're sort of showing off this technique of blending scale models with practical effects and also puppeteering, and this created a look which is unmistakable. The Thunderbirds, Stingray, Captain Scarlet, they all employ a very similar technique to create a physical world which is more than a cartoon, but obviously slightly less than live action. But we'll come back to the live action bit in just a moment. Now, the Thunderbirds. Who are the Thunderbirds? Well, first of all, there's the father of the family, Jeff Tracy. He's a leader of international rescue, a former astronaut. This is in the sort of in the near future, not too distant future, former astronaut and also Air Force colonel. And he decides that he wants to set up an international rescue team, this team that is without borders and will help anyone anywhere if they're in danger. And they're going to employ the latest technology, and they're going to not be constrained by government budgets or politics. They're going to do what has to be done to help humanity. Now, Jeff Tracy was a fantastic character. I remember basically he was one of these old-fashioned type American men in the TV series. That's the kind of character he was. He smoked a cigarette. He was a little bit sort of John Wayne-like. He was he was fairly iconic, and he was kind of, I don't know, maybe tied in a little bit with old-school James Bond. There's Scott Tracy, I believe the eldest son and pilot of Thunderbird 1. Thunderbird 1 here. Oh, careful. And Scott was always the scout. The all-American kind of, you know, I never really liked him. My favourite character was his brother Virgil. Virgil Tracy was the pilot of Thunderbird 2, and Thunderbird 2, in my humble opinion, is the best of the Thunderbirds. I actually have a larger Thunderbird toy up on the shelf just above me, where you can't quite see it. And I just love Thunderbird 2. Can't get enough of Thunderbird 2. There was Alan Tracy, who was the pilot of Thunderbird 3. Seen a little less in the TV show, but Thunderbird 3 would launch from Tracy Island, go up to space. Often to interact with Thunderbird 5, but we'll come to that in a moment. There's Gordon Tracy, sort of like the baby brother almost, I reckon, or one of the younger brothers. He's the pilot of Thunderbird 4, probably my second favourite Thunderbird, who actually emerges from a pod in Thunderbird 2's belly. Well, there's lots of different pods, but yeah, Thunderbird 4 was the main one that came out. There's also John Tracy, who was the guy who seemed to be left up in space all the time, monitoring emergency broadcasts, and he was up in Thunderbird 5, a sort of a space station circling the Earth. Not to, you know, we don't want to go into all the characters that are possible, but there's also Brains, a technician, a bit of a genius who helps the Thunderbirds with their tasks, getting over problems and this kind of thing. There's Lady Penelope Creighton Ward, who some people, oddly enough, I remember had a bit of a crush on. and when they were children. I never did, because obviously she's a puppet. But but there's Lady Penelope. There's her butler and chauffeur Parker, who apparently was a former master safe cracker, and then became a butler. So he's a man of mystery. And then there's the Hood. The Hood is a bit of an iconic bad guy. This guy with a shaven head, somewhere from the Far East, who just had evil machinations, or in terms of destroying the world or ruling parts of the world or getting lots of money, that kind of bad guy. Now the puppets did work well, as I say. They were definitely on strings, and they did move a little bit awkwardly. For example, if they're involved in a shootout, the way that their hands move and the way they move around obstacles didn't always work all that well. To the point where actually occasionally they'd have to use, for example, a real life hand. So there's one in particular where Lady Penelope has to twist something, so a hand comes in. It's meant to be her hand, but it's a real hand doing the twisting. But I loved that. I loved the fact that there was this physicality. It was like an upgrade of those really early television shows where you had puppet horses and things like that. It was the next stage. It was super marionation, as it were, definitely. I also absolutely loved the way, as a child, I loved the way that things worked. Everything made sense. So Tracy Island, the way that their home base was put together, was often mapped out in things like the annual or on posters, and you could see, okay, this is where they start, this is the living room, they go down that tube, that's how they end up, for example, getting into Thunderbird 1, or how they get into Thunderbird 2, and things like, for example, the way that the swimming pool rolled back to allow Thunderbird 1 to launch was very, very pleasing. And the fact that all this stuff had to fold and move in a way which mechanically made sense, it's partly because they were using physical models and physical puppets, and therefore it just worked. And I suppose I found that really pleasing, because I could physically imagine the thing. I could also physically imagine taking it apart, as it were. I could imagine the physicality of these machines and just how they went together. That's actually partly as well why I liked Postman Pat, actually. This sounds odd, but as a really young child I really liked Postman Pat because of the clunk click that his door made.
What did dinosaur cats look like?
Strange, I know, but I really liked that. I liked the fact that it sounded, physical and real. For example, in the sets as well, they went into great detail creating this sort of near future, retro future kind of vision of what the near future would look like, as it were. So you had things like blinking lights everywhere. And again, just the attention to detail. I really appreciated that as a child. And I think that's possibly why these worlds were so rich. Now, they did make use of scale models, and because of this, the explosions had a combination of looking both impressive and a little unimpressive. I'll show you what I mean. You can see how the explosion, it happens, the explosion occurs, but then you can see maybe the models wobbling, or the way that they roll. It's not quite as big, possibly not the epicness but possibly that they're aiming for. But again, I appreciated that physicality. I suppose the point about the physicality though is that it made it feel real. It was really happening, and sure, you could tell at times that the scale altered and this kind of thing. But for example, sometimes they'd even put sweat on the puppets' faces. So for example, Virgil, I think when he's coming in for a crash landing at Tracy Island, and it invested you in these characters. You wanted to see them succeed. Or for example, if someone was in trouble, if they were being rescued by international rescue, you had a sense of imminent danger because of the physicality, because of the fact that the stuff was really breaking and swaying and being damaged in the process of these disasters unfolding. Now, when it comes to scale, one of my favourite things as a child was the fact that water never quite worked. So when Thunderbird 4, for example, launched into the water, you could tell that it was a model going into a pond, basically. It wasn't the open sea, because the water molecules, the way that the water behaved, you can't scale that down unless you treat it in a very particular way. And they didn't have the technology at that point to do that, or they weren't looking to do that. But again, I appreciated it. I liked the fact that you could see that they were using real water, even though it wasn't scaled down. Now, when it came to the toys, my favourite toy of all was, of course, Thunderbird 2. And my brother and I both fought tooth and nail to have our own Thunderbird 2. So we ended up having one each. Now I was always convinced that his was a clone of the real one being mine, of course. But Thunderbird 2 is a die-cast model, and you can hear Thunderbird 4 inside. And the pod in the belly actually comes down, just like in the TV show. So when it came to the toys, everyone simply had to have their favourite Thunderbird. Mine was Thunderbird 2. Because I liked Thunderbird 2, at that time my brother was kind of going through a, well, if you can have it, I can have it kind of stage. So he had to get his Thunderbird 2. But in particular, if you're my age, you'll probably remember everyone wanted Tracy Island, the toy set, but it was very expensive. So Blue Peter, famously, probably their most famous ever build, they showed you how to make Tracy Island using papier-mâché and various cardboard elements, this kind of thing. And well, we didn't give it a go. I'm sorry to say, my mum just wasn't really up for us making that much of a mess. But I do remember watching it, going, "Oh, I can make my own Tracy Island. Ooh. Then my Thunderbird 2 can go inside." Yeah. But no, sadly we never got Tracy Island. Maybe one day. Now, interestingly, as a child, sort of hoovering up the merchandise, I came across something at the time called Thunderbirds 2086. It's an anime, and it's kind of like it's a vision of the future of the Thunderbirds universe in a slightly different sort of reality, that was inspired by Jerry Anderson's TV series, but produced in Japan. And it doesn't really connect. It's not really linked with Thunderbirds at all. It's interesting. It's quite funky to look at it now, to look back. Again, I love anime. I love Japanese manga, this kind of thing. But it's not really connected to it. But I just thought I'd mention it because it is out there, and you may come across it and go, "What the heck is this?" It is inspired by Thunderbirds, but it's not really in the same continuity as the original TV series. Now, this year, Thunderbirds got a revamp. The first original episode of Thunderbirds aired a couple of weeks ago. For the first time in 50 years, a new episode came out. And what are they like? What do I think of them? Well, I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I like them. I like the new Thunderbirds. Why though? How could I possibly? I like the puppets. I loved the slightly awkward nature of their movement. Well, I like Thunderbirds Are Go because they've done something very interesting. They've decided to upgrade where they could and where they wanted to, but they also have kept hold of things which made the show work. So, for example, they use physical sets and insert digital puppets, as it were, into those sets. So if you look very carefully, for example, in the opening feature-length episode, you can see that these are actual miniature models that Thunderbird 2 maybe is just sort of flying around, or maybe Scott is on top of. They are sort of harking back to the good old-fashioned miniature scale model destruction that we see in the original Thunderbirds. But they're able to have more emotion, able to do more action, things like rolls, this kind of thing, which you just couldn't do with the original puppets. So I appreciate it. They've also kept something of the way that the puppets move in how these sort of digital characters move on set. And again, I appreciated that. Weta are the people behind Thunderbirds Are Go, and Weta also did, for example, Lord of the Rings. They did King Kong. They did the Silver Surfer, specifically the Silver Surfer in The Rise of the Silver Surfer, and they also did the scale work on a film called Master and Commander, where they talked about how to scale water. So you didn't have that Thunderbirds problem where the water just looked too big for the model. They actually used techniques to sort of break up the water as it was coming towards the model of the Surprise in that film to make it work. So what's really interesting here is that it looks like Weta are using those techniques, but not too much, because they haven't lost that slightly naff look of the water. It still looks a little bit wrong, but they're choosing how and where to update their techniques and update the way in which things work, I suppose. Now, a good example of this is the launch of Thunderbird 1. In the original TV series, there was something that always used to bother me. always used to think, well, if that's a swimming pool, and if that's really being used by the Tracy family when Thunderbird 1 isn't out on a mission, or whatever, between missions, well, when it launches, doesn't it sort of scorch everything, and doesn't it blow everything away from the swimming pool? Well, in Thunderbirds Are Go, they've addressed that. When you see Thunderbird 1 launch out of the swimming pool, or from underneath the swimming pool, you actually do see some of the blowback. You see the sun lounger get blown away. The poolside equipment is affected by the heat and the air coming out of the back of Thunderbird 1. So little things like that, I really appreciate that. And again, it ties in with that sense of the physicality of the world. I think they understand what made Thunderbirds work, and that is the fact that you had an anchor, the physical anchor to these puppets, to this world, and therefore you felt as though there was physical danger and physical effects of machinery, of explosions, of water, of puppets or people falling into each other. That's what made it work, and it seems that they understand this for Thunderbirds Are Go. Now, some people don't like some of the character redesigns. Lady Penelope and Parker look a bit different. Brains now has an Indian accent instead of being a slightly stereotypical American geek. But I really don't mind, actually. I think it works. And also, to be honest, it works for the modern world, These guys have brought together people from across the globe to make this team, and it makes sense that you'll have maybe a genius from India on the team, as opposed to just everyone being white and American or white and British. I don't mind that at all. Some people are complaining, but those people probably aren't focusing on the right things. Thunderbirds Are Go, I think, has been done with the best intentions. Now, funnily enough, they've already commissioned 26 episodes and an additional 26 episodes after that. And this is where I have a slight twinge of sorrow, I guess, and that's because obviously within 1 and a bit series of Thunderbirds Are Go, they're going to eclipse the original total of 32 episodes. Eventually, not too far from now, I suppose, in the not too distant future, Thunderbirds Are Go will be the more prolific Thunderbirds, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. Then again, and this is something that I always try and underline for myself, but also other geek type people out there, the great news is that we will always have the original Thunderbirds. We'll always have the VHS tapes, we'll always have the DVD re-release, we'll always have the original toys. We can always go back and watch that stuff and get just as much pleasure from it. And we can always show it to our kids, They don't just have to watch the new one, they can watch the old one too. So, a bit of a twinge of sorrow, but at the same time, things move on. And it's not like they're burning and destroying the previous Thunderbirds. You can still watch that stuff. It's okay. It's okay. Anyway, hopefully this video has been interesting, especially if you haven't heard of Thunderbirds before, or if you haven't quite understood why on earth do people like that stuff. Well, hopefully this is sort of, laid that out for you. I love the Thunderbirds. I used to obsess over the intricacies of the designs of the ships and the technology of that time. I'm so pleased to see that they're getting a sympathetic revamp, because, well, there was a film directed by William Riker, I believe, Jonathan Frakes, and well, let's never speak of that. No, didn't happen. Anyway, as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.